to the Law, Finance and Economic Policy Talk Show, where we dissect laws and policies that govern Nigeria and Africa's financial system and economies. On today's episode, we'll be talking about Nigeria's fuel subsidy saga. Yes, this topic is very triggering for a lot of Nigerians, so it's very interesting to talk about it. As we know, Nigeria has recently changed its governmental administration, and on May 29, during President Bola Ahmed Tinubu's inauguration, he made a statement that Nigerians had long been awaiting.
Unfortunately, the budget that I've glimpsed before I assumed office and what I've heard is that no provision is there for fuel subsidy. The first subsidy is gone.
The president's announcement that fuel subsidy will no longer be applicable in Nigeria, although abrupt, is not one that was unexpected. The conversation of the removal of fuel subsidy has been in place for as long as fuel subsidies have been applied in Nigeria. Also, it emanated from previous administrators. Also, if you look at the manifestos or the agendas of the different contenders for the position of presidency, they all had fuel subsidy removal as an agenda, although the implementation of frameworks surrounding it differed. Now, from a global perspective, Nigeria is not the only one that has adopted fuel subsidies. It is something that is adopted by different countries. Countries like Indonesia, Iran, Mozambique, Ghana as well have adopted at some point or still adopt fuel subsidies. But from a global perspective, again, policymakers have been calling to question the efficacy of fuel subsidy regimes. They've specifically questioned the negative effects on fiscal sustainability. Indonesia a few years back decided to cut down on fuel subsidies by 30%. Ghana in this 2023, to remove fuel subsidies completely. Other countries like Mozambique have also done so along the years. So now it begs the question, what is the looming balance that we have to consider from a policy perspective and also from an everyman perspective? And it is essentially this. On one side, there is the importance to ensure that the average Nigerian can afford this resource that they require for transportation, that they require for electricity, and that they even require in industries and to run businesses. And on the other hand, is ensuring that funds and resources that could be used for infrastructure such as education, security, defense, and even energy are not being channeled to just providing subsidies alone. It is this looming balance in policy perspective and political perspectives that surround fuel subsidy, and that is what we're going to be talking about today. What is a subsidy? A subsidy is a form of financial aid or support that is lent by the government to an economic sector. This is usually done during periods of recession or low economic growth. It's also important to note that subsidies are against the forces of demand and supply in the market. Essentially, the market is saying one thing in terms of price, but the government has given a restricted or a designated price for that product. So I hope that's clear. Also, it's also important to note that there are different ways in which subsidies can occur. They can be producer-based, they can be consumer-based, or a mixture of both. Producer-based is when the government lends support to producers by reducing the cost of factors of production so that the producers are better able to continue to produce and supply that product. Meanwhile, on the consumer side, what that means is that the price of that commodity is reduced so that the populace can afford it. Now, when it comes to fuel subsidies, what usually happens is that the government gives a price that is below the international price, that is below the price that the market has depicted or dictated, and then they cover that shortfall with government resources. So in Nigeria, the Nigerian Petroleum Products Pricing Regulatory Authority usually determines the daily and the monthly subsidy rates by calculating the open market price. That is, what is the actual price of the imported or when you take into consideration factors of production, inflation, foreign exchange, and then what is the price that the government has depicted, and that difference is what the government covers from its resources. So we'll be talking about the history of subsidies in Nigeria. Why do we even need fuel subsidy in Nigeria in the first place? When we think about Nigeria, Nigeria is the biggest oil producer in Africa and number 15 in the entire world. So why then do we even need subsidies? And this is because although we're a big contender when it comes to producing crude oil, we do not refine our oil. We do not make it into the usable product. So that means that we export it and then we import the refined oil back. Crazy, right? Yes. But this means that by the time it gets back to us, the cost of importing it back, looking at inflation, looking at the exchange rates, and just essentially the fact that oil prices globally are even rising. When this comes back, it comes back at a significant cost. And it is this reason that we have four subsidies in place. Now, four subsidies first came in the 1970s, at about 1973, as a reaction to the global oil price shock. In 1977, Olusegun's administration, which was big on fuel subsidy, made this more formalized in form of the Price Control Act that sought to set the price of certain commodities, including fuel. Now, that's sort of a history of how fuel subsidy became formalized in Nigeria. Now, like we had earlier said, fuel subsidies are not supposed to be sustainable. Subsidies are not supposed to be sustainable because they negatively impact fiscal sustainability. So this means that for a long time as well, different administrations have also tried to cut back on fuel subsidy. Now, the first time that would happen was in 1986 with President Ibrahim Babangida taking the fuel price from 20 kobo per litre to 39 kobo per litre. Now, we also saw this in 2012 with President Goodluck Jonathan in January of 2012 when he brought about the subsidy reinvestment and empowerment program known as SHOPI. The idea was to take fuel from 65 naira per litre to 145 naira per litre so that we could be at recovery level. And then the sums that would have been used for subsidy were supposed to go into economic recovery, job opportunities for the youth, and empowerment for the youth generally. But this came with a lot of resistance. There were strikes, there were protests, and it just could not happen. So what happened was that it was taken back, not to 65 naira, but to 97 naira. Wow, unbelievable, right? Now, in 2016, President Buhari also tried to do this again, where he attempted to take the price from 87 naira to 145 naira. But however, later on, this was also reversed. And now we find ourselves in a situation where, as at April, fuel was selling for about 250 to 254 naira per litre, and now we have it as high as 600 naira per litre. As has been explained, the fact that we're not able to refine crude oil due to the fact that our refineries are performing on low capacity and we have to import it increases the cost. In 2022 alone, we spent about $10 billion on fuel subsidy. This begs the question of, do Nigerians truly benefit from fuel subsidy? Because that is a question that needs to be answered to know whether it is worth it in the first place. Now, the arguments are that those who fuel subsidy is actually meant to protect, which is the poorer part of the population, actually do not benefit from fuel subsidy. The argument or the statistics is that the bottom 40% accounts for less than 3% of fuel consumption, and that 3/4 of fuel consumption is by private businesses, government agencies, bigger industries, and transportation companies. Wow. Secondly, it is also said that the biggest benefactors of fuel subsidies are actually the importers and the wholesalers, who are able to, due to our poor border controls, smuggle subsidized fuel to neighboring countries. It is said that the subsidized fuel gets as far as Mali, where they are able to now sell those subsidized fuel and get a double profit on it. Now, the statistics on this illegal trade of petroleum is actually very low, but there are a few statistics that I would actually want to read just to put it into perspective. So BBC, for example, said that in 2011, Nigerian government paid subsidy on 59 million litres of fuel a day, although domestic consumption was approximately 35 million litres. wow, the difference is crazy. It was also said that in 2012, a parliamentary inquiry uncovered a 6 billion fraud involving state officials at the Nigerian National Petroleum Company. A few other statistics are that in June 2022, the director of the Nigerian National Petroleum Company had said that the consumption of PMS, which is essentially petrol, had increased to over 103 million liters per day, and that at least 58 million liters of this per day was being smuggled. Chapel Hill Denham also estimates in its research that 15.64 million liters of petrol are smuggled out of Nigeria daily. Now, this now begs the question of this huge difference that is being paid is not even being benefited by the Nigerians themselves. It is actually those who in the first place are receiving this shortfall that are still able to make a double profit on it. Another claim is that the government loses $700 million worth of fuel monthly due to illegal oil bunkering activities. This just means that there's no proper oversight, there's no proper control in the first place on how much we spend, and this has even increased how much we've been able to spend. So there are many who have the arguments that the question is not even about fuel subsidy removal or otherwise. It's even cutting down our costs in the first place, increasing production locally, and also finding a way to cut down the activities of those who are corrupt and take the illegal approach to benefit from it. So now that that's clear, we'll be going into discussing the actual pros and cons of fuel subsidy removal. Now let's consider the disadvantages of removing fuel subsidy, which would also sort of be the advantages of having fuel subsidy in place. Now the first thing is that removing fuel subsidy would escalate the price of transportation, food, and other commodities. And essentially what this would do would be to increase inflation and also deepen poverty. The International Monetary Fund that in 2019 said that the increase in the removal of fuel subsidies would increase the headcount poverty rate by 1.2%, and the poverty gap, it would widen it by 0.4%. So it's something to consider, which goes into the second point, which is that having subsidies in place reduce inflationary pressures. This is because the price of fuel is largely linked to the price of certain commodities, like I said, transportation, food, and some services. So this means that if we're able to keep fuel prices stable, then at least the prices of these commodities and services can be kept stable to a certain extent, specifically when you look at the other factors that are already causing inflation already. Another point is that having fuel subsidies taken away wouldn't promote growth in certain sectors, because there are certain sectors and industries that greatly rely on for production. For example, agriculture, transportation is key in agriculture, equipment is key in agriculture, and what this need is fuel. So if the prices go up, then this means that the cost of agriculture and producing in agriculture is already goes up and is going to reduce growth in those sectors. So that's something that those who say that fuel subsidy should be in place consider. Another thing is that many, which is also still linked to the points we had made earlier about who actually benefits from fuel subsidy, many feel like if the corruption can be tackled with a point where there's no smuggling, there's no bunkering, there's no conniving with even internal government agencies, then it means that the cost of subsidy itself would greatly reduce. And if the cost of subsidy itself greatly reduces, then we're not spending as much on subsidy and we can still have subsidy in place. So many feel like corruption should be tackled because if it's not tackled, even if subsidy is taken away, then corruption still remains and we still won't be able to make progress. And this also goes to the fact that if we're able to reduce corruption and increase efficiency, then our refineries, our ability to refine locally will be increased, and this would also in turn reduce the price of the refined oil in the first place. So these are just some of the arguments of those who feel like, the government has promised that the resources that should go into subsidy could go into other places or actually reduce Nigeria's debt. But then many don't have that trust in the government that that would actually happen. Many believe that, corruption will go on, the funds will be siphoned into other places. So this doesn't create trust. Many feel like at least if this is there, Nigerians have something tangible that they can benefit from, as opposed to suffering for the greater good, but then the greater good doesn't actually happen. So these are some of the views when it comes to why fuel subsidies should still be in place. Now, let's consider the benefits of actually removing fuel subsidy. The first and obvious one is positive effect on Nigeria's debt portfolio. Nigeria's debt levels are rising tremendously over the years. According to the Debt Management Office, by December 2022, our total debt portfolio stood at about 46 trillion naira, which is over $100 million. So to have this pressure taken off the government's budget would positively affect our debt levels. Now, another thing is that removal of fuel subsidy is expected to come with deregulation. That is, there's going to be reduced government interference and regulation of the petroleum industry, specifically the downstream industry. Nigeria has recorded successes in industries such as the communication and the aviation sectors when it deregulated, because it enabled private players to come in and increase competition and efficiency in those sectors. So what we expect now is that a lot of private players are going to be able to come into the downstream petroleum sector and increase efficiency, increase our levels when it comes to refining our crude oil locally. Another thing is that the fact that we've taken this pressure off the government when it comes to subsidy means that the resources of the government can be channeled towards other important industries and sectors that are lacking in Nigeria, such as transportation, education, healthcare, security. The amounts that we spend on subsidies, if they can be channeled here, would be a good one for Nigerians in the long term, and all Nigerians can benefit from this in the long term. Another thing, perhaps, is that this could be our journey towards considering more green and renewable sources of energy, and thereby, bettering our environment and reducing pollution. As we know, at the United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP26, held in 2021, President Buhari committed us to zero net emissions by 2060. And shortly after that, the climate change bill was signed into law. So this essentially shows that Nigeria is moving towards a step where it's reducing its carbon emissions and just thinking about a more sustainable country, planet, continent, where our children's children can live. And we also know that there's a lot of startups and young entrepreneurs that have taken a passion in green and renewable energy sources, and this might be a good time for the government to invest in them. So essentially, the pros are actually quite considerable in terms of what it could offer Nigerians, specifically in the long term. But the conversation doesn't end there. While many may agree that fuel subsidy removal is the approach to take for the Nigerian economy, there's also the conversation as in what manner should fuel subsidy be adopted, fuel subsidy removals be adopted. And this brings us to the economic conversation of efficiency versus equity. Now, the efficiency school of thought look at the balance sheet and the realities of the market. Essentially, fuel subsidy is creating a dent on the government's balance sheet. We need to take this out. And then everyone needs to weather the storm together. The resources will be reallocated into other industries. And in the long term, every Nigerian citizen will be better off for it. But the equity school of thought says, no, that's not good enough. There's no guarantee that in the long term, all Nigerians will benefit. And also, the government needs to look at the impact of its fiscal and monetary policies on the daily lives of the citizens. So what he recommends is a gradual and long-term approach to the removal of fuel subsidies, as opposed to just the abrupt approach that is being adopted. This is, we do things bit by bit until we can get the economy to a place where subsidies can be completely removed. Another thing that the equity school of thought looks at is how can we also provide incentives or mechanisms that will reduce the sufferings of the poor in the society. And this brings us to the conversation of palliatives. For example, Indonesia released things like transport vouchers to the poor and the elderly in society so that they could subsidize the cost of transportation. In Nigeria, we know that we have the conversations about the palliatives that will be released to the poor in society. But this now brings to the question, do we have enough data as to what qualifies as a poor in society, as a demographic that is a poor in society? And in Nigeria, where a huge amount of our society is underbanked, how is this actually going to reach those who are actually in need of it, who don't have access to bank accounts or mobile phones or things through which those resources could be passed to them? So this then begs the question of if the palliative would actually be efficient and will not just be a cost once again. But then we can still continue to look at what the equity school of thought says, which is as opposed to the abrupt removal of the subsidies, why not remove it over time? We're having a huge plan that would, as it's being reduced, also channel those resources into other industries as opposed to doing it once and for all. As we conclude, it's important to note that to mitigate the challenges of fuel subsidy removal requires a combination of policy measures, from deregulation of the sector to policies that would promote alternative sources of energy and renewable sources of energy, to anti-corruption mechanisms that are effective, and also to increasing local refinery capabilities, and in the short term, incentives that will reduce the hardship. Now, there's one thing to note. There are particular laws, specifically two that I will mention, that could also help us cushion the effect if they are properly implemented. One is the Petroleum Industry Act of 2021, which essentially was meant to promote exploration of Nigeria's petroleum resources in a sustainable manner. Another is the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2007, which is meant to ensure sustainable utilization of our resources. But the fact is that we have an implementation problem, and that needs to be looked into so that any policies that are brought into place would actually be effective. Another thing is to hone down on our ability to refine locally. While we cannot control global forces such as inflation and just rising costs generally, if we are able to produce locally, refine what we need, then that actually reduces the cost of importation of refined products, and perhaps we wouldn't have to have the conversation of subsidies in the first place. Another thing is, in the short term, what can we actually do to reduce the sufferings of Nigerians? We've mentioned a few things like when Mozambique introduced things like vouchers for transportation. Perhaps those could be considered. But now, how do we have vouchers for a transportation system that doesn't even exist? When we spoke about the subsidy reinvestment and empowerment program under Goodluck Jonathan's administration, one of the things that had been done then was to set aside funds for mass public transit buses. Things like that could be considered while we rapidly try to build a proper transportation system. In Namibia, the government introduced zero tax rates for staple foods and also gave importers some tax incentives as well. In Kenya, the government focused on electricity in rural areas, utilizing alternative sources of energy like solar, hydropower, and wind. These are a combination of mechanisms that we can look at to actually reduce suffering in the long term. But ultimately, we're hoping that the government will not renege on its promise to actually properly look into infrastructure with the resources and time and commitments that would have gone into fuel subsidies. So just let me know what your thoughts are. What are our solutions? Let's be solution providers. In the comments, let me know what your views are and what you think the way forward is. Thank you very much. I enjoyed making this video and I hope that you enjoyed listening to it. We'll see you in our next episode. Bye.